did not want to give up their leases. So Hale said, okay, well, I'm going to make your life miserable. I'm going to build the basement and the first floor, and you can suffer through that. And then when their leases were up, then he tore the rest of the building off and built the tower on top of it. Oops. How do you go back? Well, whatever. You saw that flash. I don't know how to go back. Huh? There's no back arrow on the... It's okay. Anyway, it was completed in 1895, and what was so fabulous about this building was the maximum amount of light that he was creating inside. And it was interesting in doing the research for this that one often credits the architects with such brilliant ideas, but really it was the owner, William Hale, who was pushing his architects, give me as much light as possible. I want to make sure that, you know, the doctors and dentists that are up on these upper floors can actually see what they're doing when they're examining people. And of course, the electricity was very unreliable. This building did have both electric and gas lighting, as did most of the buildings built at that period. So he was really the one that was driving this idea of give me as much glass as you can, and they complied with his request. The building suffered a long, slow decline. It had, the bottom of it was transformed many, many times. It had, I don't know, 4 or 5 major remodelings. You can see, hopefully you can see down here, how the bottom of the bay was removed. This large sign was installed. This was all done around 1940, but it had already been changed a couple of times before that. And it wasn't very well maintained. That meant that the terracotta on the building was failing. A bunch of little chunks were falling off. People were worried someone was going to get clonked on the head. You can see that they were holding the windows together with a Home Depot special. And what you can barely see down here is a piece of duct tape that's actually their version of how to keep the water out of the large crack in the plate glass window. Not a very safe situation. You can see these headers here are all cracked and have been parged up to try to hold them in place. It was really in bad shape. So one of the first things we did, we worked with a firm called Wisjenny Elfsner, who is very good at forensics. And we got out on the swing stages with them and examined everything up close. First, we cleaned the building so that we could really see what it is we were getting into. You can see that that had to be done at night because they were using chemicals that would damage the cars that were going by on probably the busiest intersection in the city of Chicago, State and Washington streets. And you also had to go out in the middle of the night to make sure they weren't spiking the juice, so to speak. They were often, at that time, you weren't always sure if the contractors were carrying out the specified treatment, so you had to make sure that keep them honest, so to speak. Here you see the work in progress. There were about 2,000 pieces of terracotta that had to be replaced, and another 1,000 that were taken out and reinstalled, and that's out of a total of about 12,000 pieces that were on the building. This was a very early, fully clad terracotta building. Maybe not the first, but one of the first. So it was experimental in the sense. Here's another workman, and in this case I don't say tradesman because this guy should not have been working on this project. As you can see, he's drilling something, and he's drilling right into the terracotta, which is of course a no-no. And I engaged him in casual conversation when I saw him doing this, and rather than say, stop that, don't do that, I just said, you know, what's going on? And he started shaking his head. He said, I don't know why they're wasting all their money on this building. They should just tear this thing down. He literally said that. And I said to myself, okay, well, this is not the guy that should be working on this building, clearly. So I went down and had a conversation with the superintendent. I said, maybe there's something else, some other job you can give this guy, like screwing metal studs together or something like that, that would be a better job for him than working on the perimeter where he could be doing some damage. And he disappeared. On the right, you see in situ testing. We had to water test the new window system that was going in there to make sure that it would be able to withstand the Chicago weather, which it did. It passed the test. We reconstructed the cornice. The cornice had been taken off in '48. A lot of cornices in Chicago were removed around that time. We believe there had been an ordinance passed, although I've never seen the ordinance language. Many of the buildings from this period were losing their cornices, probably because the terracotta was failing. We did have a good photograph. We used that and some of the other elements that were on the building to replicate the detail of the cornice itself, and we made it out of a substitute material. That is of course, okay with the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, where you have a completely missing element to replace it in a substitute material. In this case, we use cast aluminum, which will last a very long time, and after many, many trials, we were able to come very close on the color match. There you see the after, before and after. The program for the building, I could talk over an hour just on this project, and I'm not going to do that tonight to you. But nonetheless, it is important to talk about some things like the program. And the city really saved this building. They allocated close to $7 million, $6.5 million to do the exterior restoration, do the historic structure report, and to try to lure a developer that would come in and make this building into something. And so they decided to award it to a guy who wanted to convert it from the D-class, I'll call it, office space that it was, into a A-class boutique hotel. And so the architect Antunovich Associates, which is a Chicago firm, was hired to do the hotel. They engaged McClear, my firm at that time, to finish the restoration, because we only did the terracotta piece and the cornice that I mentioned. And we worked quite closely with them to finish the restoration job, and they were charged with figuring out how to retain this original corridor, which existed in completeness, or complete version of it on a couple floors, but on most floors it had been truncated and cut up and so on. So this is the layout that they were able to achieve by leaving all the existing doors where they were, and that was really important because they were getting tax credits for this rehabilitation. So the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency had regulatory review, and they required that they retain all this stuff, which was really great they did, because it really makes a difference in how this building is seen today. Have any of you been in it? No? Well, when you go to Chicago, because you need to go there, you can stay in this building. It's a great little place to stay, and it's not that expensive, so I recommend it. This is what some of the spaces had looked like before. There were literally only 4 tenants in this building before the takeover. It was a very complicated ownership situation, and the city took the building by eminent domain because they couldn't get everybody to agree on what to do with it. And this is, of course, what it looks like now. Or I should say looked like when it was done. It more or less looks like this now. Except the Gary Bandshell is out here in the park now, as you can see out that window. So ask for the corner suite when you go there. Our work on the second phase was to reconstruct the missing lobby. These are some great photographs we had. There was a couple of fragments, there was a couple of drawings, but everything is, incomplete, of course. You don't get the whole story. It's a matter of taking all the bits and pieces that you get and putting the puzzle back together again in a way that makes sense. And of course, getting it to make sense for the modern code and everything else. This had to be one of our egress paths, so we had a lot of discussions with the city code officials on how we could accomplish that. And then we had to come up with some clever ideas about deluge systems for a wall of water and so on the glass wall. Here you see the before on the left. That was a circa 1940s elevator lobby. Again, they had floored over the space. They had destroyed the 2-story space, and in progress, and then there's the completed space. The storefront was similarly missing, but we had great fortune and good documentation. Here you see these photographs. We also had a few little fragments that were trapped up here in the fire escape zone it was too big a hassle to remove them when they did these cheap renovations over the years, so they left them. And that gave us enough original fabric here. We could take these things and replicate them exactly, so we could complete the whole storefront reconstruction and do it in a way that used a modern storefront system as the way to create the enclosure, and then have a cladding that was custom made in order to mimic the original cast bronze treatment that had been given. This was the exact same location, believe it or not. That was the way you entered the building, the 32 North State doorway, which was really nasty and it's kind of scary to go in there. Has anybody in this room, would anybody go in there when it was in that stage? Okay, you missed it. It was quite an experience. and then of course the reconstructed entrance now. This was part of a huge effort on the part of Mayor Daley to revitalize State Street, and this was one of the projects that he wanted to use tax increment financing, TIF funding, to benefit the public through these restoration projects. So they ended up getting over $20 million in TIF in order to do this project. Another one that we did just down the street, this is literally a block away from the Reliance building, but it's about 10 years later, I guess, was the Carson Peary Scott store, originally the Schlesinger and Mayer store by Louis Sullivan, that became the Carson Peary Scott store, and it was primarily known as that by Chicagoans for many years. And Carson's finally moved out. They sold the building to a developer named Joseph Fried and Associates, and then they took a long-term 30-year lease actually on their space, but they were only utilizing about 4 floors of this building. So Joseph Fried started on the project. They decided they were going to renovate the upper floors of the building. They got a large TIF allocation from the city to help them with the acquisition costs and so on, and also to do some restoration treatments. So the city got very involved in writing the ordinance that determined what exactly would be done here, which included reconstructing the missing cornice and the loggia that you see on the picture on the left. That's the image that what it looked like when Sullivan was done with it. It had several additions. The 2 major ones were done here. This was done by D.H. Burnham's office after Sullivan was fired, and then this little piece here was done in 1960 by Holabird and Root, the successor firm to Holabird and Roche, which was a competitor of Burnham and Root's back in the day of the turn of the century. We had, again, some good information, some not so good information. The photographs, we had a bunch of photographs, but none of them were any better than what you see here, which was basically a big blurry mess when it got down to the situation of wanting to understand the detail. But we got a pretty good sense of what some things were. We had a few drawings that showed the outlines of things. This is the parapet as it had been replaced again in 48. Here you see again some of these photographs that give you an idea of a pattern that's up here, although not the detail. And of course, Sullivan's organic ornament is critical to understanding what his architecture is all about. So there was a lot of discussion about, should we even bother doing anything? Should we leave it blank? Or, what are we going to do? It could be a false sense of the past if we do it and we screw it up. So this was much discussed, but at the end of the discussion it was very clear that we had to do something to emulate what had been there. Otherwise it would be completely missing the idea of what Sullivan was about. And of course at 200 feet from the sidewalk, if we were a little bit off, no one would probably know, right? We didn't want to lie about it, but we didn't want to leave it blank either. We looked at all kinds of other elements in the building itself. These are all plaster capitals from the inside the building. You can see that every one of them is different. He never really replicated anything. He used a lot of things in the same family, but he never duplicated anything exactly. We looked at other buildings. We looked at other elements on this building. The picture on the right is from the cast iron storefront, and the left building is the Guarantee, I think. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, we looked at other buildings that he did from the same time. How did he treat these things? So we could get into the sort of the mindset about what went into it. We hired a sculptor conservator actually, who has sculptors that work for him, a guy named Andrzej Dagnowski, who does a lot of sculpture restoration in Chicago, and we used his studio to replicate or try to come up with things that matched the spirit of the Sullivan ornament. We also used a man named Tim Samuelson, who's the cultural historian for the city of Chicago and knows more about Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright than anybody I've ever met. He's an incredible resource. He's been collecting artifacts of the Chicago school since he was 11 years old. He used to sneak out of the house and take the bus downtown and meet all the building engineers who would give him lock sets and all kinds of stuff. It's amazing. Most of the stuff in the Art Institute's collection of artifacts is stuff out of Tim Samuelson's personal collection. So he was with us many, many times out to the sculptor studio to comment on whether or not they were getting the feeling of Sullivan's ornament correctly. So when he was satisfied, then we were fairly satisfied. So while all that's going on, there's work on the site. You see this incredible set of ribbon windows, which is running in behind that loggia, a very, very modern concept. There's the only structure of those mullions, it's all wood windows. The only thing that's there is just basically to hold the glass in place. If he could have done a butt glaze system, I'm sure he would have done it at the time if he could have gotten away with it. Here we are on site, again, matching colors. In this case, we were going to use glass fiber reinforced concrete instead of aluminum for the replication of the cornice. It was cheaper by a significant amount. But we had the same problem we do with anything you're making a new material. Even when it's the same material, you have the problem of color matching. So here we are trying to do that as best we can. Of course, there were so many campaigns of terracotta replication on this building that it was hard to know where to find the one we were matching. This is original terracotta here, so that was what we were shooting for there. And then we did full-size mock-ups. Once we thought we had the color right, we got the guy to do a full-size mock-up. And we only had to do this twice before we felt we had finally gotten it. And you can see that those were put up in place, and then we looked at them up close and from down the street to say, yes, that's finally, that's close enough, then let's go with that. It had to be done at night. The erection had to go on at night because, again, it's on State Street. So in order to close the street to get the permit to do that, they had to do that through the night. They would get the pieces hoisted up into place. In fact, they had to build their own special hoist mechanism in order to do this. And then they would get them up, and you see on this picture how they're all sort of out of alignment. That's just because they're locked in place, but then they could adjust them once they were up there in the daytime. They could take their time to get it all squared up. And here you see how it lines up. Of course, there was the question of how do we take into account the fact the building has settled so much over the years, because there were some places where things were out of whack about 3 or 4 inches. So we had to sort of feather that in, so to speak. And here you see the finished product. Right inside the windows to the left is the School of the Art Institute's architecture school. So the architecture studios are right there looking out on this beautiful new cornice. And then you see beyond it several layers of Chicago skyscrapers that create the environment for them working inside there, which is a pretty neat space. Some of the details. That's the historic and our version. And we think we got pretty close. So the historic at the top, the before, and the after. The historic and the after. So when we were completing that part of the project, Carson Perry Scott decided that they were going to move. And this was a wonderful opportunity for the building because it meant they were going to vacate these lower floors. And in the course of doing some of our other work there, we realized that this cast iron storefront was really about to fall off the building. I'll show you why in a second. And we said to the owner, you got to do something about this. Oh, we don't have any money. Oh, well, then why don't you go ask the city for some more? So they did, and the city gave them another $11 million to, or actually they gave them $9.5 million, and it cost $11 million to restore the storefronts. It would have been another $7 million to put all the wreaths and all the skooga, as we call it, back on the building. This was beyond, and there's some stuff up here that we weren't able to replicate, but we did manage to get the money to restore. And these things here, all this fantastic chains and stuff, this was all long gone. We didn't know what it looked like in enough detail to replicate that anyway, probably. So it was just as well that we didn't have to wrestle with that. Plus, it would have been a liability in the future. It fell off a long time ago and probably would do so again. Here's what it looked like before we started. And from the other side of the street, it doesn't look so bad. It had been restored once before in the late 1970s, early 80s, and basically was a very good paint job, but it didn't deal with some of the fundamental underlying problems, which was behind here. You see stuff was starting to fall off, literally. The corrosion was everywhere. It had wholesale failure of the paint systems. We took the opportunity to do a very thorough paint analysis. We had this one location right underneath this canopy here that had trapped original stratigraphies from the painting of the building before this thing got moved. It got moved in the 30s. So we had what we knew was the original treatments of the paint. This was the only place that had survived because everything else had gotten sandblasted, of course. So we used that as a place to do both in situ exposure windows, which is what you see on the right. You can see there's quite a variety. That's not rust. Those are color treatments. And here you see some of the microscopic investigation that was done, photographs of that, to show which layers we were looking for. Then the whole thing had to be dismantled. This was a huge undertaking. We tried scanning the building. You know, this idea of laser scanning was very popular. It is still popular, and it's getting better. But at the time, we thought, oh, this is a great idea. Let's do it. And we scanned the building, but it was so inaccurate for the level of detail that we needed that we actually abandoned it and relied on the guy that was dismantling this thing with his plumb bob and his string and his level to actually document where everything was and where it should go again. He did a fantastic job. And here you see the reason why it was critical that we do something when we did. This is a healthy fastener. This is one that was not this was one that was all too common on how this building was held together, or the storefront was held together, and you can see the level of corrosion. Probably much due to condensation, water, moisture vapor trying to get out of the building and then condensing on the backside of the cast iron. So. Then we had to figure out how to take the paint off, which we did we ended up doing it chemically. We tried abrasive methods and so on. Once we got the paint off, everything was repaired, and some things had to be hot repaired. This guy was a true craftsman. He was a welder who was able to weld cast iron, which is a very difficult thing to do. And we had to come back with some Dutchmen. Very little replacement of material. It's over 90% original cast iron, but there were some places where things were so far gone we had to replace them. There were a lot of cold repairs done with epoxy resins and things like that. Then there was the fitting and so on that had to go on. We used a lot of the original brackets and things like that. They were all custom made for the original installation, so we reused as many of those as we could. Here you see a full-size layout. It's a space about the size of this room where these things were fully laid out. Everything was dry fitted to make sure it would go back up on the building in the way it was supposed to before we got it out there, and they're trying to do it. These things are very heavy and they're not easy to move. So that was a prerequisite to the reinstallation. And once that was done, it was all painted in the shop with a high-tech paint system, and then of course it went back up on the building. We also replicated the retractable awning system that was an original treatment and had long disappeared, and here's that all being recreated here. And the only concession we made is now that it's electronic. It has a motor on it, so it actually retracts with the push of a button, more or less. And these are some before and afters. This is a piece that, this bottom part, that had to be replicated because it was missing, rusted away. Historic before and after. Target is in there now. It's a Target store on the bottom 2 floors, which is appropriate. In the few minutes I have left, I want to just change gears a little bit. As Bill mentioned, one of the things that's of strong interest to myself is modern architecture and how do we deal with that. We spent quite a bit of time in the class this morning talking about that, so I apologize to those students that have to see some of the same images again. But I'm going to go much faster so you don't have to listen to me talk about it as much. But the moment for me, I've been interested in this since the mid-90s when there was a conference called Preserving the Recent Past. It was actually held in Chicago. And by the year 2000, it's made the cover of Preservation magazine. So you know now it's sort of going mainstream, so to speak. And these two, this is the Lever House that had a completely replaced curtain wall, and the 2 Columbus Circle by stone that was completely reclad. That was a preservation battle that was lost, so to speak. There's an organization known as Docomomo. How many of you heard of Docomomo? Very good. This is a group of Europeans that wanted to preserve modern architecture, and it has spread to, I think there are 54 working parties all over the world. I've been quite active with them since the founding of this thing, and we're actually having a meeting next month in Sarasota, Florida, so any of you that are interested, check out their website and join us. It'll be a good meeting. For me personally, my involvement has been largely through the work of Mies van der Rohe, who is synonymous with Chicago, the second Chicago school of sort of international style, post-war modernism. And there were these two blockbuster shows that really brought Mies and his work back to life. Mies in Berlin and Mies in America. Of course, he taught at the Bauhaus in the early 30s. He left when the Nazis took over. He came to Chicago in 37 and was given two jobs: run the School of Architecture at the newly formed Illinois Institute of Technology, and you can also design the campus and all the buildings on the campus, which was a pretty sweet deal for him. He did design over 22 buildings that were constructed. There were a number of buildings that he had envisioned that he didn't get to build, most notably the library and the student center, which were done by Walter Netsch some years later, much to many people's chagrin, I'm afraid. They didn't quite come up to the Miesian standard, but nonetheless, it's quite a legacy that has been left behind. Here you see what it looked like in '67 when his campus plan was more or less completed. He, of course, died 2 years later. He had left there in '59. He had been relieved of his duties as campus architect. This was the plan for what the campus should look like in 2020, with some new buildings and so on, some of which have been built. And this is the Commons. I'm going to go very quickly through this. This is a preservation battle about the Commons. Rem Koolhaas's edition got everybody's attention. In the end of the day, they did a pretty good job restoring it. We got involved a little bit. This is sort of was how we entered the fray down there. This is Mies's attempt at universal space, which he was later able to complete with Crown Hall. This is a map of the National Register district that we were able to create on the campus. All the red buildings are the Mies buildings. And is that 10 minutes or 10 seconds? Okay. This is to show how, although Mies is thought of as a modernist, he was in his soul a classicist. He loved the work of Schinkel. This is the Altes Museum in Berlin. And there's more than a slight similarity, really, between these two buildings when you look at them closely and understand how they're thought about and so on. There's never a good picture of him smiling. He was never really a smiley guy. Very serious. There's lots of great stories about him from some of his students that we've been able to gather over the years. This, of course, is his culmination of this idea of universal space. He was able to really create it in Crown Hall, which is basically a giant one-room schoolhouse where all the students of architecture are housed under this one big space, and the four studios are gathered in the four corners. But they're really all collectively held inside this building, and it still works extremely well as a school. There are complaints, of course, about the HVAC and things like that, but students complain about everything, don't they? They do. Some of them appreciate being in this. This is a world-class building. I think this will be World Heritage someday if they're able ever to get that figured out. We'll see. It is a National Historic Landmark anyway. This is the iconic image of the lights. This is when it was first done. Wonderful Hedrick Blessing images. It wasn't well maintained, like many, unlike your university, I'm sure, which is very good about taking care of its buildings. IIT has never had enough money to take care of its buildings. So they suffered from just general neglect. They suffered from green growies getting inside the building through the dean's window. That's Dean Robertson's window there with the vine actually inside. When you don't paint steel, it rusts. No surprise there, but you know, sometimes they don't do anything about it for many years. This is what you see. This is on the inside of the building likely due to condensation on the steel with no thermal break. In replacing the glass, we were working on this project with Crick and Sexton Architects, which is a firm known for their modern buildings, their modern design, and both of them were graduates of IIT. Neither one of them studied with Mies, but they were both not far off from when Mies had been there, so there was still quite a bit of Miesian thought going on. And here you see some of the mock-ups we did. We always work with mock-ups. Mock-ups are critical to getting what it is you want as a final product. And this was the much discussed detail. You know the expression, less is more, and God is in the details and all that. So when you mess with the details, you're messing with God in a way. I mean, that's at least some people that are Miesian followers believe that. There was so much discussion about this angle, I can't tell you. And the only way we were able to convince some of them it would be okay was to do the mock-ups. And when we did the mock-ups and you couldn't see this change, they said, you know, you're right, it's okay. So we were able to do it. And of course, it's driven by the code change and requiring the additional bite that was needed for the glass. 15 weeks to get it done. Dirk Lohan on the right, Mies's grandson, who's a well-known architect in his own right in Chicago, and his great-grandson were smashing the glass. It's not original glass, so it was okay. We weren't damaging it. It had already been replaced once. Here's some of the horrible conditions that we see when we take it apart. Sandblasting it. Careful QA/QC during the course of the restoration. Checking the mill thickness on the paint. Installation of these huge lights of glass. Takes 10 guys to do it, mostly because of the union rules. And there's the finished, beautiful filtered light through the sandblasted glass, which was the original treatment and the treatment we ended up going back to for a lot of reasons, including a more sustainable way to allow the building to perform in the way that it had originally been designed. And this is just to show how the building really transforms itself over the course of a day and a night. And it's really, I mean, I go in this building a lot now because I'm down there teaching, and it just never get tired of going there. It's just such a beautiful building. And I'm going to have to stop there, I think, right? And because I have 5 minutes? Okay. 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. 860, 880, another iconic building for Mies. It's his first tall building in steel and glass. He'd done Promontory Apartments, which was an all-concrete building a few years earlier, but this was his ability to finally build the steel and glass skyscraper he'd been thinking about in his head since the 20s, when he did some much well-known sketches that he had envisioned for what a tall glass, all glass and steel building might be. And it's really, once he mastered this, he moved on to other things. He did do the Seagram building, which is a fantastic office building, and these are residential buildings, and he did a lot of other high-rise residential buildings, but none of them are as good as this first version, at least in my opinion. And much of that, I think, has to do with the fact that he delegated it to others in his office to deal with. He'd already solved this problem. He was on to other things of more interest to him. And, you know, he'd sort of, I don't know, I don't think he really was as focused on things once he'd solved the problem. He'd moved on. Here it is going up. Again, documentation is really important, understanding how it was put together. It was a prefabricated window system that got plugged in. And as Joe Fujikawa, the guy who was running this job, said, we were really naive in thinking that this was going to go together like a watch. It wasn't a watch, it was a building. And there were a lot of flaws in the way it was, even though it was very carefully done, there were a lot of flaws and not a lot of room for making up for the variations that you got in a site-built steel system like this had. We had the problem of dealing with leaky window wall, but also maybe, and this is dealing with the paint, could we paint it again or not? That was a debate. We did forensics to figure it out. The paint was failing everywhere, as you see here. It's wholesale paint failure. We did pull-off tests in order to see if we could actually get away with painting it yet one more time, which we could, so we did. Mock-ups for the paint color. It was a Detroit graphite, which has its own peculiar look, which you can't get anymore, so we had to try to mimic that. But the real issue here was the travertine plaza, which leaked. It was dead flat. I don't think it was out more than 1/4 of an inch over the entire plaza. And of course, when it's like that, you get these puddles and it leaks, and what happens is it gets down into the structural system and it starts to spall. And people have their nice cars parked down there, a big chunk of concrete lands on your hood, you're not a happy tenant. So they had to deal with this. And the problem was that less was not enough in this case. There was only about 1.5 inches of setting bed. If you were doing this, you know, today, you would have several inches of a setting bed in order to place that stone correctly. So we had, you know, how are we going to make that up? And we had to come up with some clever ways. Again, we were working with Crick and Sexton on this job, looking at different ways to do it. We installed some subterranean drains so we could improve the drainage. You can see here how that system was to work, and it's been working quite well. It's been about 6 years now, and it's still functioning pretty well, as far as I know anyway. We had to match the travertine, which called for having to make a trip to Rome. That's always a heartbreak when you got to make the trip to Rome to pick the stone. And as I said in the class, though, it really is the best way to do it, because otherwise you sit around waiting for someone to miraculously appear with the right stone, and it never is the right. You really got to go to the quarry and see what it is they're doing with pieces of the original that you're trying to match. And I've done that on 4 different jobs, and all with pretty good success. Then we had to fix the concrete. You can see how bad it is, that it actually required the complete removal of the full slab all the way through, and then recasting the concrete with new rebar installed, laying it out like you do, honing it again. This is the historic and the after picture. And the lobby with, of course, the Mies furniture, which it did have when it was originally built. That's a Hedrick Blessing picture again when the lobby was first done, and they keep it that way now. These are just current shots of what the space is like. And this is the picture of the plaza, where we've now installed some very slight slope so that the water will shed off this thing. It goes to the central drain that's here, there was only one drain in the whole plaza when it was first designed, and then there's a bunch of these subterranean ones as well. And you can't really see it. If you look really hard and you know, and I'm pointing it out, then you can see it. But it's like that detail on that stop. It's only when you know to look for it really hard can you maybe find it. So it was a change, and we are willing to accept that, but we think it was worth the change in order to give the more lasting life to this building, which it really deserves. And of course, from the inside, you can't see that we raised that level about 1.25 inches. You can't see it because it's never next to each other. So we were lucky in that the original design of this electric base, radiant heat base was able to block your vision, so you don't really sense that there's this change in level. And here's a place where we took original stone and reinstalled it so that you could see here's original stone and here's the new stone, so you can make that relationship again an opportunity for interpretation. There's no panel here, but at least you can read the new work from the old work. There you see it again on the right. It's more clear on the outside because the stone is oxidized. The old stone is more oxidized than the new. And on the inside, it blends pretty well. There is a little difference, but it's pretty close. And I'm going to leave it there. There's much more to talk about. Come to Chicago. We've also worked on a bunch of Wright buildings, which is a whole lecture of its own. But that also has its own challenges, unique challenges. It's a lot of fun to work on these great buildings of these great architects, and you don't want to get caught up in the trap of what would Mies do or what would Wright do, even though there's plenty of people that are out there willing to tell you exactly what they would do because they know. You really have to let the buildings tell you what to do and follow the guidelines as we have come to know and learn to use. So those of you young aspiring architects, learn those standards. And get to know your building and let the building speak to you about how it wants to be changed, because whenever you touch it, you're changing it. So I'll leave it there and take any questions that you might have.
Gunny's happy to hear any questions. He's come a long way from Chicago.
Or was it all perfectly clear? Yeah.
So where do you go to get terracotta done? And is there now for a lot of the buildings there that are failing on the surface, is there somebody that does that?
There's a good question. The question was, and I'm going to repeat the question since they're recording this. The question was, where do you go for terracotta, and is there someone that can do it? There's actually several good fabricators of terracotta. There's 3 in the U.S. There's really 2 major ones. One is Boston Valley Terracotta, which is outside of Buffalo, New York. They're the ones that did the Reliance building. And there's Gladdy McBean, which is in California, and Gladdy McBean has been making terracotta nonstop basically for over 100 years, I think. I can't remember what their actual anniversary is, but something like that. When they got into the sort of the restoration business, some of their material wasn't, there were some issues with it in the freeze-thaw zone. They were really good in California where they didn't have to worry about that so much. But they've made changes. They did that a long time ago, 15 years ago or more, and are able to make good terracotta. They made the terracotta, some of the terracotta replacement. I didn't even talk about that on the Carson Perry Scott store. We used their terracotta. It's really who's more competitive in the bidding market. There's a small shop in Ohio that has worked on a couple projects we did, but they can only do a limited amount. There's also a UK firm, which I'm dying to use someday, so I can make that site visit to see how they're doing it. Hathernware is their name, and they do a different kind, they manufacture in a different way. They use the technology like they make porcelain sinks and stuff out of. So it's a little bit, it's a, I don't know exactly how it works, but it's a different, it's a clay material, but it's done in a different way than the either extruded or hand-pressed terracotta. On the Reliance building was all hand-pressed, which meant, you know, a guy doing this, and which is the way it was made traditionally. It's much easier and cheaper when you can make an extruded piece, if it's an ashlar piece or things like that. It's actually not that expensive. The expensive part is putting it in the wall. That's the same, more or less the same labor, whether it's made out of terracotta or concrete block or some other substitute material. We always try to encourage our clients to use the same material whenever you can, and only using the substitute materials when something's completely missing or it's a full element like the cornice, which would have been extremely expensive to make it out of terracotta. So that was one of the reasons we didn't do it. And getting the guys to install it in Chicago, there's guys fighting over each other to be able to do it, and there's quite a few masons that are skilled in it now, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. It was a little more challenging then, but now it's very well done. They train guys in it. The Masonry Institute is very good about doing that. They have a lot of workshops for the tradesmen to do that, so it's actually not so difficult. Yeah.
So there really was not only your work, but it was a presentation about how incredible Chicago's heritage is. You have been behind all these amazing projects. And we also know recently that there is Millennium Park with this beam and Jenny Gang. So, and then you sort of briefly mentioned that Mayor Daley funded Reliance project, I think. So my
Many
question,
projects.
What do you think makes Chicago's cultural heritage in the context of architecture and built environment so special compared to the other cities?
The question was, what makes Chicago's architectural cultural heritage so important? I think, I don't know, I'm really glad it does for many reasons. It's both an environment I like to live in, but it's also an environment obviously I like to work in. I think, you know, it was born after the post-fire thing. It was all these things going on at the same time. It gave birth to that first Chicago school. All the great minds of architecture came to Chicago. They all wanted a piece of the action. That was where there was so much construction going on. Then the fair gave it another boost, if you will. I would say that, you know, it wasn't so great between that period and the Depression. We have some good Depression-era buildings, or just before that, you know, some nice Art Deco buildings, but not, and they're National Historic Landmarks in that category, but they aren't as impressive or as important, maybe, as the first Chicago school stuff. And then the post-war things, between Mies van der Rohe and Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, who built, you know, all those really great skyscrapers like the Hancock Tower and the Sears Tower, which is now known as the Willis Tower, neither one of which, by the way, are landmarks yet. They really set a tone for quality. It was about making a quality building. And I think we fell off of that a little bit in the 80s and into the 90s even. But the mayor really saw that architecture was part of this Chicago identity. Our current mayor doesn't get that. Well, I shouldn't say it, I'm being recorded. Our current mayor, I don't think, gets that in the same way. I really don't think he does. He doesn't really understand that it's really at one of the fundamental things that make Chicago what it is. You can ask any cab driver about architecture, and they know where you're talking about, they know where to take you. People on the street, they may not know exactly what you mean, but they know that there's something special about that city. It's part of its identity. So, you know, where does it come from? I think just being lucky of having had that accumulation. It's a big city, so we have a lot of stuff. We've been fairly good about taking care of it, although the recent decision to tear down Prentice Hospital by Bertrand Goldberg is a personal disappointment for me. I was very involved in that effort to try to save it, and I think it's short-sightedness on the part of the city to say it's not worth saving, even after they said it was landmark worthy. So, you know, we continue to fight, and we have great architects continuing to be there. I mean, Dirk Lohan is a really top-notch, world-class architect. We've got Ralph Johnson, we've got Jeannie Gang, as you mentioned, and many other young, talented architects that are working today. So it's a long answer maybe, but I'd like to take the opportunity to spout about it. Those of you that haven't been there, you got to come for a lot of reasons, not just the historic stuff. There's a lot of exciting new stuff. Any more questions?
I'm sure
Yep.
you have to defend it all the time, the dichotomy of whether you tear down a building and build a new one that's supposed to be cheaper or restore an old one. I look at the treasures that you've restored and think, well, obviously we must do that. How do you deal with people who say, no, tear it down and start over?
Well, it isn't always clear that it's cheaper to tear it down and start over, first of all. Second of all, in this world of sustainability that we keep talking about, you know, the greenest building is one that's already there, because you don't have to tear it down, you don't lose the embodied energy, you don't fill the dump with the junk. Even though you can recycle stuff now, still a lot of it does end up in a landfill, which is not a very good solution. It's much better to figure out a way to take that existing resource, whether it's historic or not, and find a way to give it a new life and repurpose it. Now, if it has some cultural value to it, which of course all these things do, but there's many things that have less so, but they still have some, I say that that's a sustainable, much more sustainable approach. And you can do a lot with revamping mechanical systems and looking at the building's original clues about how was it performing and so on. Of course, energy was cheap in the mid-century stuff. It's a challenge because they weren't thinking about, you know, oil prices and stuff like that. I mean, that's definitely true in Texas, I know, where oil just comes out of the ground, doesn't it? And people aren't thinking about that. But there are ways to deal with that. And sometimes you have to make a compromise relative to the historic fabric. And in some cases, it's worth doing if you can save the general aspects of the building, the meaning of the building, and so on can still come through. Like in Lever House, you know, that was a tough decision. They replaced that entire skin. They're doing the same thing at the UN building, another world-class modern building, I think. They've had to replace the entire skin there because you have these systemic failures, right? When you design a curtain wall and the curtain wall has life and it now is exceeding that life and the system fails, what do you do? So do you tear the building down? Well, not necessarily. You know, it's a lot cheaper to just replace the curtain wall with a new curtain wall than it is to tear the building down and build a whole new building. But when you do have to do what you said, when you do have to tear down a building, make it a better building than what was there, or at least as good as the one you took down. And that sometimes happens, but not often enough.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You were talking about those orientation pieces, and you were talking about sometimes you don't have a lot of pictures to go by. What is the time frame on that research to see if there's more pictures that you can find?
The question was, we talked about the importance of photographs and when do you know you've run out of time?
Right.
Well, you just hope you don't get that one magic missing picture just after you've made the decision to order the stuff that you're making. You basically never give up. I mean, we're always looking for the photograph, and I mean, I've gone as far as to try to get. Now you're in this period of the life of these buildings where people have color photographs of stuff, and I haven't seen this yet, but it's certainly in our minds to find ways to reach out to get people to send you or find out if there's someone that's got, you know, old Kodak pictures in a shoebox up in Grandma's attic or whatever. They can take that out and find the picture of someone on a summer holiday trip in front of some building that might have a picture that you don't otherwise have. We're lucky that most of the buildings of the modern period are very well documented, but sometimes there is this elusiveness of what you're looking for. And we were really lucky on Reliance that we had those pictures, or we would not have been able to be as authentic as we were. And on the Sullivan building, I don't know, it was just, we tried so hard and we're very conscious about making these decisions, and worked it really as best we could till we got something that we felt looked right. And I think that the photographs show it, and when you're there in person, you definitely get the sense of what that building was like, which is where our intent was, of course. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. You're never done looking for the pictures. Yeah.
Was there ever any talk about substituting the travertine?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask. I talked about the.
Something that was holy.
Well, the question was there ever any discussion about substituting the travertine? And I assume you mean on both the Crown and 860, or either one maybe. Yes, of course, many architects, and especially, would say, why would you replace it with travertine when you know it's going to fail again? Which is a very fair question in the environment we have in Chicago. Well, the answer is because that was what was used. And changing it to white granite or some other color. Now Mies did use granite. He used granite at Seagram's. He used granite on some of the other IIT buildings. And Joe Fujikawa, who was in his office, he swore that if Mies were alive, this goes to this statement I made earlier, if Mies was alive and he had the money, he would use granite. He wouldn't use travertine. And you always have to give that a huge grain of salt because, number one, Mies isn't alive. Number two, even if he was alive, you don't know that that's what he would say. That's what Joe thinks he would say. And the most important thing is that he didn't. He used travertine, or he used granite in some cases. And that is what is part of the story of what that building is. So to change that up really would change the way that thing looked. I mean, he loved the material. He used it at Farnsworth House, and he could have probably used anything he wanted to at Farnsworth House. He used it at the Barcelona Pavilion. He used it. He liked that material. He used it on the interiors of other buildings. He used it on the 3 apartment buildings he did at IIT. That's all travertine as well. It's all terrible. It's fallen apart. Again, because it has no setting bed. It's part of the problem anyway. So it wasn't by accident that he used it. And what's that?
Is it filled or?
It's not filled. It's not filled. And so far, I have to say, other than the fact that a couple of the stones on the Crown Terrace are cracked because of someone dropping something on it, they have held up pretty well. So it's really the biggest key is having a proper setting bed, getting the drainage to work, keeping the drains from clogging up, which they were doing this is a problem at Farnsworth House too, I believe, where there's these drains underneath and they fill up with all the runoff because there is a little bit of the material itself dissolves, and then you get stalactites and stalagmites under the porch where it's going, growing together basically. And that was going on at Crown Hall for a very long time. They also used a crushed stone that was part of the drainage system that was also a limestone-based material, and that was adding to that problem. So, we avoided all those pitfalls and have much better waterproofing membranes than what they had in those days. So, we think we'll get a lot longer life out of it. Will it last forever? No. And in that sense, you have to think of it more as an ephemeral material like paint. I mean, paint doesn't last. You have to recycle paint or redo paint with a regular thing. Now, stone is seemingly more permanent, and yet it has a limited life, right? Again, a long answer for your question, but it would have been a huge change, aesthetic change and material historic change to go to something different than the travertine. And I wouldn't get to go to Italy either.
Yeah, then maybe Mies like to go to Rome too. One more question, and then additional questions just come up front, I guess afterwards, because maybe others need to hit the road.
You talked a lot at the beginning about the importance of your Danish heritage
Uh-huh.
to inform your practice, and you visited Denmark several times. It may not be possible to answer this adequately in the time we have left, but how would you compare the Danish attitude towards preservation, cultural preservation, with what you've encountered here in the States?
That's the question was about Denmark and my interest in that, and would I compare their approach to preservation, conservation versus the American version. Well, I have to say I never studied conservation there. I did go to the Royal Academy, but I was in a design studio, and that wasn't really part of the discussion. But I do know from my understanding, particularly back when I was interested in learning about these things, that they had a very disciplined way of documenting buildings. I fell in love with the open air museum outside of Copenhagen that's called the Frilandsmuseet, which is the open air museum is basically what it means. And they took these rickety old, funny thatched roof farmhouses that were all like, you know, leaning over like this, and they completely documented, rather than setting them up straight, you know, like they were probably when they were original, they reconstructed them all like this. And I was just fascinated by how could they do that, or why would they do that? And so they were very true to the authentic quality that was there. And they have, you know, a lot of regulatory oversight on some buildings, not on everything. And they're very careful about how they do it. Their training for conservation architects is within the school is quite rigorous. I do know that. And it's sort of a branch off. I think that it's 5 to 7 years in order to get a degree in architecture there. And you know, you branch off after the 3rd year or something like that into the conservation course if that's what you want to do. But most of their architects do multiple things. They don't just do one thing or the other. Did that answer your question? Okay. All right, well, I'll hang around a little bit for those of you that didn't get your questions answered, and thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you tonight.